Lone rancher for years, until Apache widow came said, "My child needs a father." Samuel Thompson had always been a man of the land, a rugged, solitary figure. He spent his days working the ranch, caring for his cattle and maintaining the homestead that had once been shared with his beloved wife. Married, but after her death many years ago, the house, the fields, and the land had become more than just a place of work. They had become a reminder of what he had lost. His heart had been left empty, and though the ranch had once been a place full of love and laughter, now it was silent. The open plains stretched far beyond what his eyes could see. He had built a life for himself here, far away from the busy towns where people went about their lives with little care for what lay beyond their city walls. Samuel didn't mind the isolation. In fact, it suited him. There was something peaceful about being alone with his thoughts, something calming about the routine of daily chores. He had gotten used to the silence of the land, and he had grown fond of the quiet, unhurried rhythm of life. But even so, loneliness had crept into his soul. It was an old friend, one that came and went over the years, but always lingered in the corners of his heart. Samuel was no stranger to the empty feeling that came with living alone. His wife Mary had passed away from illness when he was still a young man. Their love had been full of promise and hope, but that hope had been stolen too soon, leaving only memories behind. Those memories had long since faded, but the hole she had left remained. Sometimes on long nights when the wind howled through the cracks in the cabin walls, Samuel would lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what could have been. He had no children to carry on the ranch, no family nearby to visit. His friends had long since moved away or passed on, and the few neighbors he had lived too far for casual visits. Most days it was just Samuel, his thoughts, and the cattle. He took care of the ranch as best as he could, but it wasn't the same without someone to share it with. There were mornings when the sun would rise over the hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The sight was breathtaking, but Samuel couldn't help but notice how empty it all felt. He was the only one there to witness the beauty of the sunrise. He would often stand on the porch, looking out over the rolling hills, and think to himself, "Is this all there is?" The work kept him busy, yes, but the solitude gnawed at him. It was as if the land itself was trying to remind him of his loneliness. Still, Samuel kept going. He had no other choice. The cattle needed tending, the fences needed fixing, and the land needed care. He rose early each day, tending to his animals and doing what needed to be done. He kept busy to keep his mind off the quiet, off the emptiness. The work was hard, and sometimes it felt endless, but it was something he could do. It was something that kept him grounded, something he could rely on. But deep down, Samuel knew something was missing. There was a void inside him that no amount of work or isolation could fill. Years had passed since Mary's death, and Samuel had grown used to the silence, though it never felt quite right. It was as if the land itself was waiting for something, for someone to come along and bring life back into the home. Samuel didn't know it yet, but the winds of change were blowing across the plains, and soon his life would take a turn he hadn't expected. As winter approached, the days grew shorter, and the chill in the air began to bite harder. Samuel spent his days fixing up the barn, checking the cattle, and making sure everything was in place for the cold months ahead. The ranch wasn't the same as it once was, but it was still his. Every corner of it held memories of a life he had built with love, and though he had let go of some of those memories, others remained, rooted in the land itself. On one particularly cold morning, as Samuel rode out to check the herd, he noticed something different in the air. The wind had shifted, and there was a strange feeling in the atmosphere. Samuel paused on his horse, taking in the surroundings. The land stretched out before him, but for some reason, today it felt different. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, as if the world itself was holding its breath. He shrugged it off and continued on his way, but the feeling lingered. He went through his usual routine, feeding the cattle, checking the fences, and making sure everything was in order. But as the sun began to set that evening, casting long shadows over the land, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. He stood on the porch once again, looking out over the vast plains. The sky was turning a deep orange, and the wind had quieted, leaving only the sound of his own breathing. In that moment, Samuel realized something. He had spent so many years running from the loneliness, hiding behind work, behind the land, behind the silence. But it was still there, creeping into his thoughts, tugging at his heart. He had built this life alone, and now, for the first time in a long while, he found himself asking, what if there's more to life than this? The thought stayed with him through the night, long after the stars had filled the sky. Samuel lay in bed, staring at the ceiling once more, but this time, something felt different. He was no longer content to simply exist in the silence. He wondered if there might be someone out there who could fill the empty space in his life, someone who might change the course of his future. But he didn't know how to begin. The years of solitude had made him wary of change, of new faces, and of the unknown. He had closed himself off from the world, and now the thought of opening up again seemed both terrifying and exciting. What if he let someone in, only to be hurt again? The fear of losing someone else, of having his heart broken once more, held him back. But deep down, Samuel knew one thing. The emptiness he felt wasn't going to go away on its own. It was a hunger he couldn't ignore forever. As the days passed, the feeling grew stronger. It wasn't just about filling the silence anymore. It was about finding something real, something lasting. Samuel Thompson had lived for so long as a lone rancher, but now he couldn't help but wonder if it was time for something more. The question echoed in his mind, louder than the sound of the wind or the creaking of the cabin. Could it be that after all these years, after all the heartache, there was still a chance for him to find something worth living for? The thought seemed impossible, yet Samuel couldn't shake it. The winds of change were blowing across the plains, and soon he would learn just how much his life was about to change. Ayanna was no stranger to hardship. Born into a family of the Apache people, she had learned early in life that strength wasn't something you could ask for. It was something you had to find within yourself. She had been taught to stand tall, to face every challenge with grace, and to keep moving forward, no matter what. Life had never been easy, but the strength of her people had always been her guiding force. Her husband Taos had been a proud warrior, brave and strong. Together they had built a life, and she had dreamed of raising a family with him. But that dream was shattered when Taos was killed in a skirmish between settlers and their people. Ayanna had watched as the love of her life was taken from her. His blood spilled on the ground. The pain of that loss was something that would never truly leave her, but she had no choice but to keep going. She had to be strong, for herself and for her son, Kiona. Kiona, her young son, had been born after Taos had passed. He was just a baby when his father was taken from them, and Ayanna had promised herself that she would raise him to be the man his father had never gotten the chance to become. But raising a child alone was no easy task, especially in a world that seemed to be growing more uncertain by the day. Ayanna had the support of her community, but there were days when the loneliness threatened to overwhelm her. She would see families, men and women with their children, and it would remind her of what she had lost. She had no partner to share the burdens of parenting, no man to help her with the heavy tasks that came with caring for a child and maintaining a home. Her life had become a constant struggle, but she never complained. The Apache had always endured hardship with dignity, and she would do the same. Kiona had grown into a bright, inquisitive boy. He was curious about the world, always asking questions about his father and why he couldn't be there with them. Ayanna had always told him that his father was a great man, a warrior, and that one day Kiona would grow into a great man too. But deep down, Ayanna knew that Kiona needed more than just stories. He needed a father. There were times when she would watch him play with the other children in the village, and a pang of sadness would strike her heart. Kiona was strong for his age, but there was a softness in him that reminded her so much of Taos. She could see it in the way he looked at the other fathers, in the way he seemed to yearn for something more. Ayanna knew that Kiona needed a father figure, someone to show him the ropes of manhood, someone to teach him the things that only a father could. One night after a long day of work and caring for Kiona, Ayanna sat by the fire, her thoughts heavy. The weight of the decision she had been avoiding for so long finally seemed impossible to ignore. She knew she couldn't raise Kiona alone forever. The boy deserved more. And in the back of her mind she had an idea. It wasn't something she had wanted to consider, but the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. There was a man she had heard about, a rancher who lived far from the village, a man who had spent years alone working the land. His name was Samuel Thompson, and from what she had heard, he had never remarried after the death of his wife. Samuel Thompson, the lone rancher. She had heard stories about him, how he had built his homestead from the ground up, how he had lived in isolation for many years, tending to his cattle and maintaining his ranch with no one by his side. She didn't know much more about him, but the stories were enough to make her curious. Ayanna had never met him, but she had heard enough to wonder if he might be the one to help her, to be the father Kiana needed. The thought of asking a man she had never met to become a father to her child seemed almost impossible. It felt like too much to ask, too much of a risk. But then again, what choice did she have? Kiona needed a father, and she needed help. She could no longer do it all alone. After much consideration, Ayanna knew what she had to do. She would find Samuel Thompson, and she would ask him to be a part of their lives. It wouldn't be easy. She had no idea how he would respond, or even if he would be willing to help. But she couldn't keep ignoring the truth. Kiana needed a father, and it was her responsibility to ensure that he got the care and guidance he deserved. The next morning, with her heart pounding in her chest, Ayanna set off on the long journey to Samuel's ranch. The land was vast, and the roads were often treacherous, but she was determined. She knew that this was the right thing to do, even if it was terrifying. Her mind was filled with 1,000 questions. What if he refused? What if he didn't want to be a father to a child that wasn't his? But despite the doubts, Ayanna pressed on. She had no other choice. She had to try. The journey was harder than she had imagined. The weather was cold, and the trail was rough. But Ayanna never wavered. Every step she took, she thought of Kiona, of the boy who deserved so much more than she could give him on her own. She thought of the future she wanted for him, a future with a father who would teach him the ways of the world, who would guide him as he grew. By the time Ayanna arrived at Samuel Thompson's ranch, it was late in the afternoon. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the land. She had never seen the ranch before, but it didn't take long to recognize it. The ranch was modest but well-maintained. There were barns and fences, cattle grazing in the fields, and the unmistakable smell of the open plains. It was a place of solitude, a place of hard work. Ayanna hesitated at the gate, unsure of what to do next. Her heart raced in her chest, and for a moment she wondered if she had made a mistake. She had no idea what kind of man Samuel Thompson was. But then she remembered why she had come. Kiona needed a father, and she had to do whatever it took to give him that. With a deep breath, Ayanna walked up to the ranch house. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear the sound of someone moving inside. She knocked lightly, her hand trembling as she did. The door opened, and there, standing in front of her, was Samuel Thompson. His eyes were dark, and his face was weathered by years of working the land. His expression was guarded, as if he had not had many visitors in a long time. Ayanna felt a rush of nerves, but she stood tall and looked him in the eye. "I've come to speak with you," she said, her voice steady but unsure. Samuel raised an eyebrow, his gaze scanning her for a moment before he stepped aside, allowing her to enter. Ayanna could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she walked into the ranch house. This was the moment. She had no idea how it would go, but she was ready to ask the question that had been weighing on her for so long. Samuel Thompson was not a man used to surprises. Life on the ranch had been quiet, solitary, and predictable for years. The long hours of hard work, the steady rhythm of tending to the cattle, and the solitude of the land had kept him busy. Visitors were rare, and when they did arrive, it was usually someone from the nearby town asking for help with something, or perhaps a traveler looking for directions. But Ayanna's visit was unlike any he had ever encountered. When she stood there at the door, her eyes filled with determination yet tinged with something else, vulnerability, Samuel could not help but feel an odd sense of curiosity. He had not expected someone like her to arrive at his ranch, and yet there she was, standing before him, as if fate itself had brought her here. Ayana's voice was calm but steady, though Samuel could sense the uncertainty behind her words. She had not come for small talk or a casual visit. There was something urgent, something important in her presence. He stepped aside, motioning for her to come in, and watched her walk through the threshold of his home. The ranch house was simple but cozy. The walls were made of rough-hewn wood, and the floors creaked underfoot. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. Samuel had always preferred the simplicity of his home. There was no need for extravagance when all he needed was a roof over his head and a place to rest after a long day. The silence of the house, however, had grown heavy over the years, and as Ayana stood there, looking around, Samuel realized just how empty it had been without another person to share it. Ayana set her shawl aside and took a seat near the fire. Samuel, feeling the weight of the silence between them, sat across from her. He studied her for a moment, taking in her strong features and the quiet dignity that seemed to radiate from her. There was a calmness in her eyes, but underneath it, Samuel could see the storm of emotion she had carried with her. Her shoulders, though straight, seemed to hold the weight of a lifetime of hardship. Samuel could relate to that feeling. It was the same burden he had carried since the death of his wife. Ayana's gaze never wavered. She was here for a reason, and she was determined to see it through. Samuel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unsure of what to say. He had lived alone for so long that the art of conversation had become foreign to him. But Ayana did not seem to need small talk. She simply looked at him and spoke from the heart. "My name is Ayana," she began, her voice steady but carrying the weight of years. "I am a widow, and I have a son. His name is Kiona." Samuel nodded, his silence urging her to continue. Ayana took a deep breath, her fingers twisting the edge of her shawl nervously. "I've come to ask you for something. Something I never thought I would need to ask anyone." Samuel tilted his head, waiting for her to continue. His mind raced, but he remained silent, unsure of what to expect. He had no idea what she was about to ask, but something told him that it would be a request that would change everything. "I've raised Kiona on my own," Ayana said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Since Taos was killed. I've done my best, but there are things I cannot teach him. Things he needs to know. Things only a man can teach." Samuel's brow furrowed in confusion, and Ayana's eyes met his with a quiet intensity. "I've heard of you, Samuel Thompson," she continued. "I've heard of your strength and your kindness. I've heard that you have lived alone for many years, and I've come to you because I need help."
Samuel felt a pang of discomfort.
He wasn't used to being the subject of anyone's curiosity, let alone someone asking for help. His life had been one of self-reliance, and the idea of depending on anyone had always been foreign to him. But Ayana's words were different. There was no arrogance in them, no demand. It was simply a plea, one born from a mother's love for her son. "I need someone to help raise Kiona," Ayana said, her voice firm. "He needs a father. He needs someone to teach him how to be a man, how to live in this world with honor. I can't do it alone anymore. And so I ask you, will you be that man for him?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Samuel sat in stunned silence. He had not expected this. He had not expected her to ask him to step into the role of a father, especially not to a child he did not know. The idea seemed absurd at first. He was a man of the land, used to working with his hands, to caring for animals, but not children. He had never raised a child, and yet, as he looked into Ayana's eyes, he saw something that stirred something deep within him. A longing, perhaps, to fill the emptiness that had been with him for so long. But there was more to it than that. He saw in her a strength that matched his own. He saw a woman who had carried her burdens alone, just as he had. She was not asking for pity or charity. She was asking for something real, something that required a commitment. It was a request for help, but it was also a request for trust. Ayana's hands were folded in her lap, and her eyes, never left his. She was waiting for his answer, and Samuel felt the weight of it pressing down on him. He had not expected this, but now that it was here, he could not turn away. For a long moment Samuel said nothing. His mind raced with thoughts, each one more confusing than the last. Could he really do this? Could he become a father to a child who wasn't his? Could he open his heart to someone else after all these years of living alone? The doubts whispered in his mind, but he pushed them aside. He could not ignore the truth in front of him. Ayanna was asking him for something that, in its own way, was a gift. An opportunity to share his life with someone, to give back to the world in a way he had never considered. Finally he spoke, his voice low and steady. I don't know if I can be the father Kiona needs, Ayanna. I've never raised a child. I've spent my life alone working this land. I've built this ranch with my own hands, but I've never had a family. Ayanna nodded as if she understood. I know this is a lot to ask. I know this is a lot to ask. I wouldn't ask if I didn't believe it was possible. Samuel's eyes softened. I never thought about being a father again. I didn't think I had it in me. He paused for a moment, considering the words that would come next. But I see what you need, Ayanna. I see what Kiana needs. Ayanna's face lit up with a mixture of hope and gratitude. You would help us? She asked, her voice filled with quiet relief. Samuel nodded slowly. I can try. I can teach him what I know. I may not be able to be his father in the way you hope, but I can show him how to live this life with honor. I can show him what it means to be strong, to stand tall in the face of hardship. Ayanna's smile was gentle, but filled with emotion. That's all I ask. I just want him to have a chance. The fire crackled softly in the background as the two of them sat in silence for a moment, each of them realizing that their lives had just changed forever. Samuel Thompson, the lone rancher, had just made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. It was a decision that would bring him closer to the world he had kept at arm's length for so long. And for Ayanna, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where she no longer had to carry the weight of motherhood alone. The future, uncertain as it was, now seemed a little brighter. The weeks that followed Samuel's decision to help raise Kiana were filled with change both subtle and profound. It wasn't an easy transition for either of them, but each day seemed to bring something new, a lesson learned or a small step toward becoming a family. Ayanna, though relieved to have Samuel's help, still carried the weight of responsibility for Kiona. Her heart was full of gratitude, but she didn't want to put too much on Samuel too quickly. Raising a child, especially one who wasn't his own, wasn't something that could be done overnight. But Samuel wasn't the kind of man to shy away from hard work, and as time went on he found that the task of teaching Kiona wasn't as daunting as he had first imagined. At first there was a certain awkwardness between Samuel and Kiona. The young boy was understandably unsure of this stranger who had suddenly entered his life, and Samuel was just as uncertain about how to interact with him. He had no experience with children, and there were moments when he wasn't sure what to say or do. But little by little they found their rhythm. It started with small things, helping Kiona saddle a horse, teaching him how to care for the cattle, and showing him the basics of working the land. At first Samuel simply observed Kiona, unsure of what to expect. But as he spent more time with him, he began to understand the boy's nature. Kiona was bright, eager to learn, and full of questions. His curiosity reminded Samuel of his own youth, when everything seemed new and exciting. It was easy to see the spark in Kiona's eyes, the same spark that Samuel had once had, long ago. There were times when Kiona would look up at Samuel with that same childlike wonder, asking questions about the world that Samuel didn't always have answers to. What did it mean to be a man? How did you know when you were ready to take on the world? Samuel didn't have all the answers, but he did his best to answer truthfully, drawing on the lessons he had learned over the years. There was no manual for fatherhood, no instruction book on how to raise a child. But Samuel did what he could. He taught Kiana about hard work, about standing strong in the face of adversity, and about the value of honesty and integrity. These were things Samuel knew well, and he passed them on to the boy with quiet confidence. Kiana's smile, though shy at first, grew more frequent as the days passed. It was a smile that made Samuel feel like he was doing something right. It wasn't the kind of smile you could fake. It was the genuine expression of a child who felt safe, who felt that the world was no longer so big and lonely. Samuel couldn't help but feel a sense of pride every time he saw it. It was a sign that, despite the challenges they faced, they were making progress. Ayanna, too, noticed the changes. The bond between Samuel and Kiana was growing stronger each day. She could see the way Samuel looked at her son now, with a tenderness that spoke volumes. It wasn't just about teaching Kiana how to work the ranch. It was about something deeper, something unspoken. Samuel had taken Kiana under his wing, and in doing so he had begun to heal some of the wounds that had lingered in his own heart. For Ayanna, it was a quiet sort of relief. She no longer had to watch Kiana struggle with the absence of a father. She could see the difference in him, the way he stood a little taller, the way his confidence was growing. The lessons Samuel was teaching Kiana weren't just about ranch work. They were about life, about becoming the man he was meant to be. And Ayanna could already see the transformation in her son. But it wasn't always smooth sailing. There were days when the weight of their new dynamic felt heavy. The ranch was still a hard place to live, and there were times when the work seemed endless. Samuel was used to the quiet, solitary nature of ranch life, and though he had always been self-reliant, having a child in the mix changed everything. There were moments when he felt like he was being pulled in too many directions at once. He had never expected to be a father, and sometimes it felt like there was no room for mistakes. The responsibility of guiding Kiana felt like a heavy burden, but Samuel knew that this was his new reality. He couldn't turn back now. Ayanna, too, had her moments of doubt. She had never intended to rely on anyone this way, especially not a man she had just met. But Samuel's presence had become a steady, calming force in their lives. Still, the question remained. Was she doing the right thing by asking Samuel to take on this responsibility? Was it fair to him? She had been a mother and a widow for so long, and now, with Samuel's help, her life had changed in ways she hadn't anticipated. She didn't want to overstep, to make Samuel feel like he was being forced into a role that didn't suit him. But deep down, she knew that Samuel's willingness to help, his willingness to become a part of Kiana's life, was a gift. It was a gift that could change everything for them. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills and the sky turned a rich shade of purple, Samuel and Kiana stood side by side, gazing out over the land. The cattle were grazing in the distance, and the ranch was quiet except for the sound of the wind rustling through the grass. Kiana, who had been working with Samuel all afternoon, seemed more at ease than ever. Samuel could see it. The boy's confidence was growing, his posture straighter, his smile wider. He had begun to trust Samuel in a way that was both heartwarming and humbling. "You're doing well, Kiana," Samuel said, his voice low but full of pride. "You've got the spirit of a true rancher." Kiana grinned, his eyes sparkling with pride. "I want to be just like you, Samuel. I want to work as hard as you do." Samuel looked down at him, surprised by the depth of the boy's words. For a moment he felt a wave of something close to affection, something he hadn't felt in years. The loneliness that had once defined his life seemed a little less overwhelming now, with Kiana by his side. "You've got the heart for it, Kiana," Samuel said, ruffling the boy's hair. "And that's what matters." Ayanna, standing at the door of the house, watched the scene unfold. The sight of Samuel and Kiana together, the two of them working side by side, filled her with a quiet sense of peace. This was what she had hoped for. This was the family she had dreamed of. Samuel had become not just a partner in the work, but a father figure to her son. He had taken the boy under his wing, showing him the ways of the world with patience and kindness. It wasn't just about raising a rancher. It was about raising a young man who would know how to stand tall, how to face life's challenges with courage. For Ayanna, the change in Kiana was evident. Her son was no longer the shy, uncertain boy he had once been. He was growing into someone strong, someone with a sense of purpose. And much of that growth had come from Samuel's influence. It wasn't just the hard work. They were learning from each other, growing together. Ayanna walked over to them, her heart full. "You two look good out here." she said with a soft smile. Samuel turned to her, his face softened by the quiet pride he felt. He's doing well. Kiona's got a good head on his shoulders. Ayana's eyes met his, and in that moment she knew that this was the family they had built together. It hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but together they were learning to be a family, and that was more than she had ever hoped for. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, and for the first time in a long while Samuel felt at peace. The loneliness that had once haunted him seemed far away now, replaced by something stronger, something that would grow with each passing day. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were living. As the seasons changed, so did the lives of Samuel, Ayana, and Kiona. The once quiet, solitary ranch had transformed into a place of warmth and connection. The work was still hard, the days long, but there was a new rhythm to life, a shared purpose that filled the space where loneliness once lived. Samuel had never imagined that his life would turn out like this, that he would find himself teaching a young boy the ways of the world, or that the bond between them would grow so strong. But here he was, and as he looked out over the ranch he knew that something had shifted, something deep inside him had changed. Kiona was no longer the shy, uncertain boy who had first arrived at the ranch. He had grown in ways that Samuel hadn't expected. His confidence was visible in the way he moved, in the way he spoke, and most of all, in the way he worked. It wasn't just about learning to handle the cattle or fix a fence. It was about becoming a man, and Samuel had watched him take those first steps with pride. He was proud of how far Kiona had come, but there was more to it than that. Kiona had become someone Samuel could count on, someone who was learning the same lessons he had learned when he was a boy. And in doing so, Kiona had become more than just a student. He had become a partner. The days were still filled with work, but now there was laughter too. The morning started earlier, the work more hurried, as Kiona would join Samuel for the first time with a smile on his face, eager to begin the day's tasks. They would ride out to check the cattle together, Kiona asking endless questions, always curious, always learning. Samuel found himself enjoying these moments more than he ever thought he would. The quiet of the mornings, the bond that grew between them as they worked side by side, had a comfort to it that Samuel had not expected. Ayana watched it all with a sense of fulfillment in her heart. She had never imagined that she would find someone like Samuel, a man who would help raise her son, who would offer him the guidance and strength she had so desperately wished for Kiona to have. She had always carried the weight of raising Kiona alone, but now, with Samuel's support, the load was lighter. There were still moments of doubt, of course, moments when she questioned whether she had made the right decision in asking Samuel to become a father figure to Kiona, but those moments were fewer and farther between. Each time she saw Samuel and Kiona together, her heart swelled with gratitude. They had become a family in ways she hadn't dared to dream. One evening, after a long day of work, the three of them sat together on the porch, watching the sun set behind the hills. The sky was a brilliant mixture of pinks and purples, and the land stretched out before them like a sea of gold. It was a quiet evening, the only sounds being the soft rustling of the wind and the distant call of a bird. For the first time in years, Samuel felt at peace. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding that they were no longer alone in the world. Samuel, who had spent so many years in isolation, now had something he hadn't realized he needed: a family. Kiona leaned back in his chair, his legs stretched out in front of him. "Do you think we'll always be here, on this ranch?" he asked, his voice curious but thoughtful. Samuel, looking out over the horizon, considered the question. "I reckon this place has a way of holding on to people," he said, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "But what do you think, Kiona?" The boy looked up at the sky, as if weighing the possibilities. "I think it's home," he said finally. "I think I'd like to stay here, work with the cattle, just like you." Samuel nodded, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "It's a good life, if you're willing to work for it. But it's not just about the land, or the cattle. It's about what you make of it. You can do anything you set your mind to, Kiona. This ranch, this land, it'll always be here. but it's what you choose to do with it that matters. Keona's face lit up, a smile spreading across his face. I want to make it a good place, he said with determination. I want to make you proud. Samuel's heart softened at his words. You already do, Keona, he said quietly. You already do. Ayanna, sitting beside them, watched the exchange with quiet joy. The love between the two of them was unmistakable. Samuel had become the father Keona needed, and Keona had become the son Samuel never thought he would have. The bond they shared was something Ayanna had longed for, but she had never imagined it would happen so naturally. Samuel had not only accepted the responsibility of raising Keona, he had embraced it, and in doing so, he had become part of their family in every sense of the word. The nights on the ranch were peaceful, and though the work was hard, it no longer felt as heavy as it once had. The days passed in a comfortable rhythm, and as the seasons turned, the three of them settled into a routine. They worked together, shared meals, and spent time together in the evenings, talking about their days and their dreams. The silence that had once filled Samuel's heart was replaced by the warmth of family. It wasn't perfect. No life ever was, but it was real, and it was theirs. There were still challenges ahead, of course. Life on the ranch was never easy, and there would always be work to be done. But the future felt brighter now, more hopeful. Keona was growing into the young man Ayanna had hoped he would become, and Samuel had found a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for so long. As the years passed, Keona continued to learn from Samuel. He grew into a capable young man, strong and confident, with a deep respect for the land and the lessons his father had taught him. Samuel, in turn, found himself looking forward to each new day, knowing that he was not alone. He had a family now, and that was more than he had ever expected. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Samuel looked out over the ranch and realized how far they had come. He had never thought he would find a place in this world again, never thought he would find a family, but here they were together. It wasn't the life he had planned, but it was the life he had built, and it was good. Looking at Ayanna and Keona, Samuel realized something else. He had found a new purpose. The love that had once seemed so far out of reach was now right in front of him, and it was more than he could have ever hoped for. He turned to Ayanna, his voice filled with gratitude. You know, I never thought I could be a father again, he said. But having Keona here, having you both here, it's made me realize that there's more to life than just surviving. There's love and there's family, and that's what matters. Ayanna smiled, her heart full. I'm so grateful, Samuel, she said softly. You've given us both a future. Samuel's eyes softened as he looked at her. I didn't do it alone, he replied. We did it together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting its final rays over the land, Samuel realized that this was the life he had been waiting for. The life he had always needed but had never known how to find. A family, a purpose, and a home. Things he had once thought lost, but now had in abundance. The ranch was no longer just a place to live. It had become a place where love, strength, and hope grew with every passing day. And for the first time in many years, Samuel Thompson felt like he had everything he needed.